So 5G4D has been going for nearly 5 years now, and I'm sure many of you will have missed some of the early interviews because you weren't there at the beginning. I mean, why would you have been? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release some classic episodes from some legends of the industry that you might have missed. And so I hope you enjoy these shows, and I hope you enjoy the brand new ones that come out every 2 weeks. So thank you for listening, and enjoy. Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is not only a designer of games, but a ruminator on the role games play. He's designed games that deal with weighty historical themes like John Company and An Infamous Traffic, as well as more whimsical fare with Root. His designer diaries read like popular history books, and his reviews are probably the most thoughtful and rigorous in the industry. My guest this week is Cole Wherle. Cole, welcome.
Thanks, Ben. I'm glad to be here.
So, before we start, how difficult was it for you to choose these 5 games? Was there a lot of gnashing of teeth, or was it very easy?
It was hard. It was hard because I had trouble. I was trying to imagine those that would be with me, and I'm a big believer of bringing the right game to the right audience. And then I thought, no, I'm thinking about this completely backwards. I need to imagine that isn't an issue, and to just pick the games that resonated most with me, which just made problems worse because the first list I think was probably 20 titles. But after I kind of, created the right kind of categories, it became pretty easy to snap up the ones in those categories.
And so what were the categories? What were the stipulations that you used?
Games that I could think about a lot and play a lot. I ruled out games that I imagined myself easily getting tired of. And so there are certain war games that I think that are probably amazing for the first 5 plays, but then they start to wear on you. So that was important as a criteria. And then I wanted a variety of topics and weights, just so that so games that approached kind of different problems and even within the space of the game had a really big dynamic range. So I didn't want just an economic game. I wanted an economic game that could be very strategic or very tactical. That could scale well at different player counts. So believe it or not, I think if I changing the premise of your show a little bit, if I had to cut down my collection to just 5, like in the here and now, these would probably be the 5 that I would pick, even outside of Apocalypse.
Well, my premise is very flimsy, so feel free to do whatever you wish with it. But when you sent me a bio and you said that, with having kids and stuff, your game time has changed and the types of game you play have changed. So have you found yourself playing a lot lighter games, shorter games that require less investment than the big heavy war games?
In certain respects, my wife and I are, partners in so many things, and we're also good game partners. And we used to indulge in a lot of weighty 2-player games, and that's been a category that's been somewhat evacuated. In fact, Titan is on there because it was a game I played a lot with my wife. But with kids, we're usually doing the shorter fare. So lately it's been a lot of Azul and Heaven and Ale. But without, the distraction of movies and TVs, I could imagine Titan kind of coming back. And that's why it made it on the list. That change is partly to do with the kids, and it's also, something that is still in flux. Like, as the kids have gotten older and gotten better about going to sleep, we have found ourselves kind of re-gravitating towards those heavier titles. In fact, just a couple nights ago, we pulled out Duel of Ages after the kids were in bed and played probably a 3-hour grudge match of it.
So if we go back to the beginning, so you up until fairly recently, have spent your life in academia. Just give us a quick background of what you studied, why you studied it. Why did you go into those areas?
So I've just recently defended and kind of exited the academy, maybe for a little bit, maybe for a long time. I was a journalism student as an undergrad. I studied journalism, and as I was kind of a wayward student, like a lot of people in the academy. High school didn't really, or my secondary school didn't really motivate me at all. And then when I got to college and things got difficult and my teachers got really interesting, I found myself subconsciously kind of stepping up more. But I studied mostly, so I studied journalism kind of with the intention of being a reporter, and then found that it's exhausting in ways that I didn't understand what I was really getting into, I think, when I first started studying journalism. And I was also in journalism school during a time where the internet and Craigslist especially had destroyed newspapers. But social media hadn't saved journalism. And so there were no jobs for young people wanting to be reporters. And so while I was filling out my schedules, I started taking more English and history classes. And I happened to be at a school that was very, very strong in 19th century studies. So I was taking a lot of classes with very prominent Victorianists and a lot of people studying empire. And at the end of that program, I worked a variety of jobs, but was also doing some freelance research work, and my mentors were encouraging me to apply to graduate school. So because it seemed like the right thing to do at the time, I applied for a PhD program and then spent the better part of a decade in Austin at the University of Texas, where I studied 19th century literature and the British Empire, specifically in India, but in some other corners as well. And I loved graduate school. I think by the time it's over, many people find themselves pretty bitter about the experience, but I loved it all the way to the end. And I would have been very happy, I think, finding a university gig.
So when did games come into your life? How long were you playing since childhood, or was this more of a pursuit you got into as you got older when you got to university?
Games were important from my earliest memories. My dad taught us how to play chess when we were very young. And I think, or actually maybe it wasn't so much games were important as play. I had parents who played make-believe with their children. And games for sports and board games and puzzles and riddles and all manner of kind of play was a really important element of just growing up in my household. I have lots of siblings, and all of the siblings had a way of bringing all their friends into the house. So we were always at play. And that thread was fused with kind of an anti-establishment, I really want you to understand how to play soccer and hockey, but don't ever join a league. If you want to play a game of football, you should go find 9 friends, and then we'll build some nets in the backyard, and you should play that way. So gaming was social. It was symptomatic of a larger kind of importance of play, and we were playing games. I mean, some of my earliest memories are playing Stratego with my father, and then there were just lots of little happenstances which kind of led me to games when I was quite young. I played Catan in elementary school on an old German copy, and it was just we wore that game out. And then I had friends who had uncles and grandparents who were interested in kind of modern Euro games. And so when the Christmases and birthdays rolled around, there were always copies of Puerto Rico, Taj Mahal, Battle Cry, very close to their actual release. So, I think I probably played Puerto Rico the same year it came out. And I would have been in middle school at that time. And we were, of course, just completely massacring all the rules. But these were just the things that happened to be floating around my childhood. It wasn't something I sought out.
And so, reading your designer diaries and your reviews, they come across, if not academically rigorous, certainly journalistically rigorous. Did you always look at games in a sort of more analytical sense, or did that come later?
I think the thing that pulled me growing up, again, playing lots of different kinds of things, and video games are certainly included, the thing that pulled me to games was, at the start, was I think something like their self-containment and the rigor of the. I wouldn't have described it that way as a kid, but there was. I remember moving from playing a lot of miniatures games, Games Workshop games, to those Hasbro Avalon Hill games. This is the late '90s version of Acquire and History of the World and Battlecry. What was so compelling about those titles was that the entire world of the game was inside that one box. And so suddenly I didn't need to cajole all of my friends into building these miniature armies. We could just play it in that set. And then when I got to university, I started looking at the games a little bit differently, because I found myself preferring board games to video games. And then, because that was I think it was a strange opinion, I was being constantly asked to defend that position to my friends who would prefer that we play a bunch of Half-Life. And I think that little crucible of just justifying to, my dorm mates that we should play a game of El Grande instead of Unreal, I think that's where, that apologetic is kind of where my own thinking about games was really shaped. Because I looked at something like El Grande, actually, and would think, this game is more aggressive and interactive and brutal than any shooter that you can play on your computer right now. And in working that defense and in just trying to fill the table on our dorm's lounge with players, I think I started crafting a way of talking about games. And then it helped that I was using BGG a lot and was talking to people who were a lot older and had been thinking about games a lot more than I had. And they started giving me pieces that I could use to kind of build a language for talking about the games.
So we'll go on to your first game, and the people who know you and have seen your work, the games you've designed, and also the criticism that you've created, might be surprised at this first one. And this first one is Bonanza. Why did you choose this one?
Well, I wanted a Rosenberg game because I admire his designs a lot, and I thought first it should surely be Agricola, which is a seminal game of my wife and I's courtship, and something that we still play. I probably have over 100 games of Agricola logged, but Agricola is not his best game. It's a great game, but it's not his best, and his best is so clearly Bonanza. So I think online I tend to talk about the heavier games that I play, but if someone catches me at a con, they're as likely to see me flicking wooden discs or wearing a goofy crane on my forehead or playing some of the sillier games as well. And because I find that I like a clever design in any form it can be, and Bonanza is just brimming with cleverness.
What does he do in this game that makes it an evergreen? I mean, it's sold over 2 million copies, Bonanza, and it's sold in corner chemists in Germany. I can buy a copy if I go down the road to buy a bottle of shampoo. What is it about this game that makes it so captivating for everybody, it seems?
When you're designing, there is a temptation to try to get the players to think that you are very clever as a designer. And when you're playing a game that is cleverly designed in that way, you're thinking, what is the value of the family growth action in Agricola? What's Rosenberg thinking? And in Bonanza, Rosenberg, like a great designer should, understands that the designer can never, ever, ever be as clever as the players. And Bonanza is a game about understanding the people who are sitting around the table and how they value things and manipulating those values. So it doesn't matter what the jumping bean might be worth in the game. It's understanding what that bean is worth to the people sitting there and then creating this language of obligation about what that favors worth of maybe taking something that you don't need. So this game is just thriving in this kind of weird donkey space of suboptimal play where where players are being rewarded for coming up with really clever solutions to problems that go so far beyond a logic of like a set exchanges or something. And I think because the design emphasizes the people that are playing it, it has a replayability that is going to surpass any other system that Rosenberg creates.
And is his range, little games like Bonanza and Patchwork and big games like A Feast for Odin, Agricola, is that an inspiration for you as a designer? Would you like to go into those areas of small card games? I mean, you've done Pax Pamir, but, lighter fare.
Yeah, and Pax Pamir is a small game that only looks small, and then it's too big for itself. I think actually, as I've transitioned to working in the industry commercially, the thing that is so cute about Pamir and its small box is actually just sort of misleading, and I think it potentially would have done better. Not that it didn't do bad; it did poorly, but I think it was a bit of a cheat, and it would have been better like marketed in kind of a GMT form. I think that, but to your question about range, I think that there is something remarkable about Rosenberg's range, and his consistency. I mean, I think there's a whole coterie of German designers, especially, that seem to be able to work well at any form factor. And that flexibility is something that I admire. I don't think I can emulate it. I mean, I do have projects that would be better suited to the smaller form that I'd love to be able to see through. But I think that there's a second thing about Rosenberg's range that I think is particular to his position in the industry and of designers like him, which is that he is able to keep making the same game over and over again and to play. It's almost like variations or something, right? So you have Agricola and then you have Fields of Arle, and they're different. But he's asking similar kinds of questions. And then Feast for Odin, there's a little bit of patchwork in there, but it's like if I were to keep making PAX games for the rest of my career, and then you could see influences of other things I'm working on, and so like his range is both wide, and then also he's able to go very deeply into a single space. And that second part of the range is not something I think I'm personally interested in, but I really admire it. Like, I think some people looked at Feast for Odin or whatever his, the one I can't pronounce, the game about Norway or something. Nusfjord. I think people look at that and they say, like, he just keeps making these Viking games. And I actually think it's sort of wonderful that there's a place in the industry for somebody to just be investing in this project of kind of working through similar problems and finding different ways of approaching those problems. That element of his range I could never emulate, but I do think it's great that the industry can support it.
So why did you go into design, and what were your first forays into design then?
I went into design because there were certain types of games that I just didn't feel like I was seeing. So it was, which is to say, it was purely selfish. And I think there are some folks, and this means I mean to cast no shade. I know a lot of people who go into design because they want to produce things that have their names on boxes, which I think is awesome. It is a wonderful thing to bring something into being. But also like they want to make sort of small adjustments to previously worked formula. And I think that's fine, and there's a lot of room for that kind of like incremental work. But for me, it was I was reading these history books and finding all of these really fabulous tensions that I just felt like were nowhere. They were just nowhere in games. I don't think I've ever actually talked about this. A lot of my first designs were, I guess, more properly just variants. I played a mountain of Risk growing up, just a huge, impenetrable mountain. I think I could probably draw the Risk map from memory, and I still think it's a fabulous game, despite what everyone might think. But I came up with lots of variants for Risk that had feudal politics and vassalships and kind of really complicated diplomatic systems, because I would play a game like Twilight Imperium or Game of Thrones, and the diplomacy always felt it always, so as different, like if you take the Fantasy Flight Game of Thrones and Twilight Imperium, as different as those two games are in the way they approach economics and science and military concerns, their diplomatic worlds are exactly the same. You have kind of like betrayals, and everybody has like this little contiguous nation state. And I didn't realize this when I was in high school, but they're all trapped in essentially like 19th century conceptions of the state. Like they're just stuck. They have not thought about the way that politics can be different and more multilateral than like a one person, one nation, one state model. And, you know, Sid Meier's Civilization is stuck there too. And what's so interesting is when you read books about diplomacy and books about politics, it's complicated. The state is always kind of tearing itself apart with all these different interest groups. And so these were just intuitions I had that I wanted to see something that was a little bit more robust and that really fleshed out the problems that I thought were really interesting. And so that led to little risk variants, and I tried to make a computer game version of the Three Kingdoms, which didn't quite work, but sort of works, and maybe I'll revisit it someday. And lots of like Twilight Imperium variants that I came up with. And so I started working in variants, and then eventually created little systems. But I couldn't really see any project through. I think Pamir was the first project that I like completed properly.
And so how did it feel to be published by Phil Eklund? Because when you wrote to me that you'd played his games quite extensively before then, did you have a sort of a feeling of, I'm trying to find the word now, did you feel sort of like very privileged, or was it, oh, this is just a natural progression of my designs?
I didn't hindsight's a funny thing here, because looking back at it, Phil offering me money for Pamir and publishing it was clearly this huge moment that my whole career kind of pivoted around that one moment. But at the time, it did not seem important. Like, it was exciting, but it was obvious because, and I think that has to do with how Phil develops games. Like, you know, I had been developing Pamir, and it was so obviously the kind of game that he would publish. And I did all the graphic design for it, and I made it look like his games look. And when I offered it to him, my own thinking was, this comes from my own experience working on the editorial side at the university. The articles that have the best chance of getting published are the ones that look a lot like the things you already published and do interesting things and will require very little work on the parts of their editors. So when I was building Pamir's submission, I just tried to hit those criteria. Like, I wanted it to look. So there were footnotes in the rules, for instance. I wanted it to look like the kind of game that Phil would publish and to seem like the kind of project that wouldn't require a lot of his work. And it just seemed like a very natural thing that he would pick it up. And so, you know, I sent it to him, and then about a week later, he played it and said, "Oh, well, I want to buy this, and do you think you can have it ready for May? And then it'll be released in the following year." And I said, "Of course." And we worked out terms and signed a contract. And because I had been helping and was in a lot of the conversations around Greenland, and had kind of seen that project grow, you know, Phil and I had lots of back and forth in emails, and this was like yet another project. It wasn't until later when I think Phil, after the release of Greenland, I think Phil had kind of a meteoric rise in terms of his visibility. Which coincided with my own very small, like starting to publish, the kind of beginning of my design career. And I think it was really later, like with John Company, actually, when I was getting through that, and I realized, like, I started becoming overwhelmed by the fact that, you know, here was this game I had really worked on, which is being published alongside a major release, and this is Bios Megafauna 2, of one of my favorite designers, and I get to be in his group and in his stable in this area, and I think that over the last year, I was a little overwhelmed by it all. But it took many years for me to have enough perspective to know that, to realize how lucky I had been, and when I had started talking to Phil.
So your next game is, I must confess, a game I had no idea existed until I went on BGG after I got your list. This is Titan, which is an old Avalon Hill game. Can you, for the listener, can you just give them a quick précis of what this game is?
Titan is an old Avalon Hill game. It was originally designed outside of Avalon Hill, and then I think they took it in and might have done a little bit of development on it. And it is a game, so before I describe it, I'll say it is a game that everyone should know about, and people who design should study it, because it is among the best game, the most interesting and best games ever made. And now that I've built it up, I will tell you its theme, which is it is a fantasy monster slugathon, like war game, I guess. You recruit armies of centaurs and you battle with each other, and then one player wins. Everybody has a big Titan, which is kind of an RPG hero that levels up throughout the game, and then you try to be the last Titan standing. And that description, the kinds of people I played games with in undergrad were usually put off by fantasy themes. They seemed like a little childish. And I think I myself was contaminated a little bit with that and sort of moved away from the more thematic games for several years. And when I got a copy of Titan, I didn't teach it to them because I thought, this is like, they're not going to like this. They're going to think it's goofy. But then as I started playing it with my wife, my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, it was so rich. And so I couldn't help myself but say, like, look, I want you to ignore the fact that we're fighting with bears wearing armor and just look at the math. Look at the beautiful structure of this game. And it won over the house, and it was in constant play. So Titan does a bunch of remarkable things. It's sort of like the shared ancestor of, it's inspired a lot of things. I think like Richard Garfield has talked about Titan with respect to magic. And also, if you've played the game Heroes of Might and Magic, Titan is the board game version of that. So there's a world map, and then when you get into battles, there's a little battle map. But what makes the game so remarkable is that all of the numeric systems, all of the numbers are, I think sometimes people who know more about math than me talk about there being a beauty in mathematics. And I think I know kind of what they're talking about when I think about a game like Titan, because every number is used in a bunch of different ways. So a number might be, on the one hand, used for movement, and on the other hand, it's used to determine the hit value of a particular, to figure out the hit value between units. And another number is the number of units, like the unit's toughness. And then it has another thing that I, for some reason, can't think of right now. And also how many dice they roll in combat. And when you multiply those numbers together, suddenly you have the experience points that are gained when you kill that creature, and all of that is overlaid this really wonderful probability game where you're trying to muster and move around your armies and figure out the best ways to grow your forces. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, and the rules are so clean and just so there's an abstract beauty to the design as well. I love the first edition of the game because everything is hand-drawn but is done in silhouettes. So it almost has like a chess-like character. And I could play that game 100 times and be completely satisfied.
So I read an article that you wrote about an American Civil War game. You mentioned that Avalon Hill started bringing what you called, I think, adult respectability into games. Firstly, what does that mean, and how does Titan reflect that?
What I mean is, when it comes to the kinds of hobbies you're allowed to have as an adult, there is a little game that gets played about class and about respectability. So, for instance, board games, I'll give it just as an example, board games seem very expensive. And I would be hard-pressed to spend many $100s on a board game. And even if I did do that, and I have for certain rare, weird train games, I would never tell someone. So I'm sure you're not going to tell anybody, Ben, that I've spent all this money on board games. But if I spent that much money on a golf club, that is hardly something that would require even note. In fact, if I had a nice pair of golf clubs, it'd be assumed that I'd spend a lot of money on them. So there's a thing that happens, and if you go back to H.G. Wells and Little Wars, his book about wargaming, there are these ways where he's trying to justify the hobby as something that is more than just for children. And when you get into board games in the 50s and 60s and 70s, you can see it all over the place. So the old Avalon Hill games are very clean looking. Games are a serious, worthwhile endeavor for the thinking adult. And I think that is something that you don't really see in the game industry at the current moment. And it's sort of interesting. And I think it has to do a little bit with I'm going to screw up all of my terms because I'm so far away from a sociology class, but like the trend around the infantilization of the adult, right? So like it's okay to like Disney and be an adult. So it's also okay to like play a bunch of board games. And so when you look at, I'm surrounded by board game shelves right now. So I'm looking around, I'm looking at all these game covers that could be marketed to kids or to adults or to some kind of adult child. And I think that's great because it shows a comfort with a wider range of human experience. But it's important too to know that like we have like this was something that we had to earn because a long time ago, 40 or 50 years ago, it was a tenuous thing to have friends over and play a strange board game.
But do you think it's not? Do you think? I think you're kind of saying this, but do you think it's not just sort of taken as read now within the hobby board game world that these are for adults, and adults are the main consumers, and so we don't need to show men in waistcoats sipping whiskey on the back of boxes because we all know it's for us as adults now.
Right. And so I'm looking, my boss has a bunch of Zombicide boxes right across from me, and they have a kind of comic book look that is, I think, well pitched at the 20-something or 30-something gamer with some money who wants to play in this sort of fantasy world. And you don't have to pretend that this is a kind of a respectable thing. I completely agree. I think that the hobby has moved to a place where everything is sort of assumed to be for a kind. I mean, I hate the term gamer because it's so loaded, but there is this kind of gamer class that all of these games are directed at, which kind of is assumed a certain level of complexity and fiddliness and expense that's built into the games. And when you go to the older titles, you don't quite see those categories as cleanly. So a big issue, and this is something I'm kind of skirting around, is gender, right? Like a lot of these games are being sold to men, and there's a kind of like masculine play. The Zombicide font looks very serious, very like manly, for instance. And when you look at something like a choir, there are men and women playing, and this is sort of like what you're doing at a cocktail party. And so in some respects, even if like an old game box seems retrograde in certain areas, in other ways, it's quite forward, even though, the gender politics of the 1960s are not something anybody would want to ever return to. So with respect to Titan, though, I don't know who that game was marketed for because it has the Avalon Hill cover of that game is hilariously bad, I think. It's like got a weird, like, it's got like a strange, like Grecian god face on it, and there's like two monsters fighting. And the actual like layout of the game is very garish. But within that, like once you step into its palette, if you can imagine that, it's quite beautiful and functional. But it doesn't make any effort at respectability at all. And in fact, it was often, I think that the original boxes, like they might even advertise it as like a Monster Slugathon, which is such a, kind of, I find that like a little demeaning because the game, like I would call it like it's a game about like outwitting your opponent. It's highly strategic. And it's almost chess-like. I think it would be more at home being thought of along in the lines of like chess and backgammon than Rising Sun or Blood Rage.
So, moving on, I need you to help me because I have a friend who is a dyed-in-the-wool grognard, and nothing angers him more than when I call Small World a war game. And so, first of all, I mean, you play a lot of war games, and you've played a lot of war games for a long time. Can you give me a concise definition of what a war game is?
There's no way to do this without aggravating at least like 30% of everyone listening, but I'll do my best. So I tend, a while back, someone I kind of consider a friend who I talk a lot about board games with, they said, it's important to remember that whenever we talk about genre, we're really just talking about marketing. And so genre is a very useful way to sell something and a very bad way to describe something. And so I think along those lines, war game is a conflict simulation. It has to have some kind of simulation value to it. Now that doesn't mean, we can talk about the different levels of accuracy, right? So I remember once I was playing a battle cry game, and we sort of did some back of the envelope calculations to figure out how large the units were in our battle cry game, and then we were very gratified to find that the casualties at the end of the game were actually quite in line with what had historically happened. So, and battle cry is not a game that really has tries to do anything interesting with simulation outside of some command and control issues, of which it excels at. So I think there are kind of two tiers to it. Like, I think you can be very ecumenical and say, war games are any kind of conflict simulation that includes the conflicts between various like mismatched fantasy empires fighting each other in something like Small World, or it could be a highly calibrated like campaign for North Africa. We're going to count all the food rations. Both of those things can be war games. The harder question is, what is the war game simulating? What are you getting? And this is the place where I think the grognards who want to push Small World, or even something like Twilight Struggle, out of their camp, what they're trying to say is, war games have to have some kind of simulation value, and Small World may be a wonderful game, but it doesn't tell you anything about the way these people work.
So, and I've talked a lot about my attitudes to war games, and I'm squeamish with a lot of the themes of war games simply because, how do I say this? It feels to me slightly unseemly to be recreating on a tabletop the deaths of real people in real situations that were hugely scarring and traumatic for whole continents. Am I wrong with this? And if so, why?
You're not wrong, and more people should be squeamish. This is a funny thing coming from someone who made a game about the Opium Wars, but I was going to play a game of Fire in the Lake, which is a big coin game designed by Mark Herman and Volko Runtke. I can never pronounce his last name. I think those are the two that designed Fire in the Lake. But it's a big coin game about the Vietnamese, the war in Vietnam. And in order to prepare for it, I started watching the Ken Burns documentary, and found myself so affected that I gave up my seat at the game. I just couldn't play it. And I play games about awful subjects, but there was the war. Wargaming is a privilege of distance when you can only So I think the way I tend to think about it is your distance from a circumstance enables you certain kinds of perspectives. And some of those perspectives can be indulging in thought experiments, such as what if the Nazis would have done this, or what if they would have done that? And these thought experiments can be really interesting, but they are also two things can be true at the same time. These thought experiments can be extremely interesting, but they can also be morally depraved. So the example that comes to mind a lot is a game that has really impacted me and I really love is GMT's recent game Triumph and Tragedy, which I tend to dislike World War II games because of their distance from politics and their distance from the things that are so interesting about the 1930s. And Triumph and Tragedy is the first World War II game I've played which understands that World War II was this colossal historic accident that didn't necessarily need to happen the way it happened. And it gives you the feeling of paranoia and the feeling of the modern world like run away from itself. And I can only enjoy that game and enjoy playing each of the powers, all of which have different levels of moral compromise, right? Like I don't mean to put any equivalency, but the West was awful, but the fascists were much worse. But I can take the fascist position and I can allow myself to kind of experience some of the thoughts that were informing both their strategic and their political posture. But it is purely a privilege of my own distance from that war and from the human trauma. So I sympathize with people being squeamish about games, because I think if you look at a game, if a game like I like games that attempt to traffic in things that matter, and if a game makes you feel, if it revolts you, if it makes you feel awful about something, I'm happy for it, because that is the power of the form. I think games are engines of affect. They can really allow us to understand different perspectives. And for that specific reason, I like games that put me in morally complicated positions, but only the games that are smart, only the games that treat their subject matter seriously. So the coin games, which are about contemporary insurgent operations and multilateral conflicts, they are disturbing. Andean Abyss is about the Colombian drug wars. Cuba Libre is with the Cuban Revolution. Distant Plain takes the recent war in Afghanistan. And these games look squarely at hard topics, and they make me uncomfortable. Whenever I play Andean Abyss or Cuba Libre, I feel extremely uncomfortable, and I feel like I have to make horrible things. But play is a space where players can kind of explore an uncomfortable moment and then step out and reflect. And a game that enables that kind of stepping out and reflecting is something that I'm going to be interested in. On the other hand, when I see a war game that is a little more flippant or jokey, it tends to turn me off and to make me feel to make me feel like it's both not necessarily worth my time and also like it's undercutting the seriousness of what it can do. So I find myself not playing a lot of war games for that reason. But I think that this is something that everybody has to kind of negotiate for themselves and to think about the kinds of experiences they want to inject themselves with.
And do you think that war games that strictly focus on the tactics and strategy of battle, the role of the general, do you think they're neglectful?
They are, but you have to make decisions. I think the most interesting decisions any designer makes are the decisions about victory and the decision about who the player is. All the other decisions are kind of boring. And they're not boring, they're just not as important. They're of an order of magnitude less important. Or they're less important by an order of magnitude. And for that reason, a game that focuses on the concerns of a general, if I'm going to make a game about a conflict, it seems like that isn't necessarily something that moves me. And I think that there's a lot of wasted room there. And it's also, there are good ways to simulate those concerns, but there are also bad ways to do it. And so a game I love and respect, Squad Leader, is sort of quite bad about this, because its view of squad level combat in World War II is just hilariously ahistoric. It is a lot more like a classic Hollywood movie about squad combat in World War II than it is about actual squad combat. And so a game like Up Front, which is a card game that was later published, which focuses a lot more on morale and about uncertain geography, gets it right. And so I'm okay with the game saying, you know what, we don't have space to do the refugee crisis. That is a reasonable decision, but if you're not going to make a game about the refugee crisis, make sure the thing you're doing is also important and interesting. And I think that there are a lot, and I'm picking on World War II games, but I think that they are particularly afflicted with this. There are a lot of games that are kind of like easy war games, where even though they might have lots of rules, they're neglecting the things that are really interesting just to, have everybody play general. And that's something that I'm kind of never interested in.
So your next game is a game I love from people I'm developing something of an obsession with. And this is The Great Zimbabwe. So 2 questions really. Firstly, why do you think the Splotter guys are held in such high regard? They're sort of the connoisseurs, producers. And then out of all of their titles, why is it this one you chose?
When you play a Splotter game, you sometimes get the feeling that the only games they play are the games they design. And I mean that, and I know, first of all, I know that's not true, because, I mean, if you look at Jeroen's writing, like, it's patently not true. He plays lots of games, and they clearly have an influence on him. But they are so focused on the questions that they are interested in and not on the marketplace that you get this almost hothouse effect, where these are games that are interesting, heavy games that are interesting, bred by other heavy games that are interesting, and they're not deck builders because that's the flavor of the month, or they're not worker placement games because that's the flavor of the month, or role selection games because, and I'm kind of going back in history here, like, they're never impacted by it. Or they never feel like they're impacted by it because they are they're so focused on the questions in game design that compel them personally. And I think that it produces something that is almost singular in this hobby. And the hobby has exploded over the last decade, and that has done a lot of good. And I'm always happy that, a wider array of different kinds of people are making games, which is a good thing. But I think that in that connectiveness, it breeds a kind of homogeny where games are starting to be kind of similar to one another. One Dudes on a Map game is kind of like all the other ones. And then when you look at a company like Splotter, they are still so clearly doing their own work that I think they well deserve the kind of seminal place that they've arrived at. Because for a lot, and you know this as well as I do, for a lot of especially newer gamers who are playing the kind of heavier, stranger, harder games, Splotter is something that you kind of arrive at. Like, you don't learn about them right away. You go deep into Reddit or deep into Board Game Geek, and then somebody mentions Food Chain Magnate or Roads and Boats, and then it's probably the first game you spend $100 on. And when you play it, it's like nothing else. And then you discover that all their other games are like nothing else. But of their games, so I think I've played all of them. And that's courtesy mostly the Board Game Geek library. But and I like them all, even the weird ones. Like, I love Can. I love the art of Can. I think it's amazing. Can is an amazing game. It may be a little broken, but it's amazing. And I almost picked Can, but I thought, it's got some problems. And I really admire Roads and Boats, which is exhausting, especially if played combatively. But of all of their designs, The Great Zimbabwe to me feels most like every element of their production, their kind of idiosyncratic aesthetics, the mechanics and the interactions of the players, the weird bits of asymmetry and spatial problems that they put in their games. Every single thing that they do, in the same way that Rosenberg is kind of like always working in a similar area, every single thing that they investigate in, I feel like in The Great Zimbabwe, like every tumbler in the lock just like is in alignment. I think it is absolutely their best game by a fair margin. And I don't say that to discredit their other games. I just think it was just a completely remarkable achievement.
So you published a few games. You published John Company. You published An Infamous Traffic and Pax Pamir. And then you became an employee of a game company. So you recently started with Later Games, and your first game, Root, is going to come out from them. How did this come about?
It's a strange thing. It's the kind of thing that if ever I'm asked to talk to people about careers. I couldn't give this as advice to anybody. I had just submitted my dissertation, and for anyone who's gone through that process, they know there's this about 3-week period where you submit your final draft and your defense is in a few weeks, and there's kind of nothing for you to do but be nervous. And so it's a Friday afternoon, I submit it off, and I go to Twitter, and I'm still at my desk, and I see a posting for a game developer position. And I hadn't really thought about working in the industry. Everybody I knew who did anything with board games, they did it part-time. They did it because they loved it. And many of them weren't compensated at all. But I saw this job listing, and I was still sitting at my desk, and it was early on a Friday afternoon, and I was on a little bit of an adrenaline kick from kicking off this 250-page document. And so I submitted it. I submitted an application for this job in St. Paul, and I've been kind of wanting to live in the North where my kids could see winter and everything. And then that night or the next night, Patrick Leader, the publisher, wrote to me with some production questions, and they were having some problems with a game they were working on. And he just kind of asked for my advice. And we just sort of started talking. And it begun this sort of 2-month-long courtship where I never really had an interview, but we were just kind of always talking about games. And I liked Vast. It wasn't my favorite game, and I had critiques of it, but my critiques were on the order of, I was very clear that I thought he was up to something quite interesting and that he still needed to work at it to get it right. And so he started learning a little bit, because Patrick, and I don't know if this is public, but I'll say it anyway, Patrick had never played any of my games. I think he and I are at different parts of the hobby. I was like very much on the heavy side of the Board Game Geek community, and Patrick was, he's on Board Game Geek, but he's in a kind of a totally different corner of the hobby. So he hadn't played any of my games. I had played Vast, and I was just sort of talking to him about games, and so he learned a little bit about my own design philosophy and how I think through problems. And then I learned from Patrick what he was trying to build. And, to that, Patrick had this idea that he wanted to move away from the submission-based, part-time-based labor that characterizes a lot of the industry and start a small studio. And this studio was made possible because of Vast's huge success on Kickstarter. And he wanted a small workforce of full-time labor committed to developing and building really, really good and polished games. Because there are a lot of games that get published that just aren't quite ready. And so he really wanted just an absolute crucible to really come out with some lovely things. And that idea attracted me immensely. And so Patrick kind of waffled. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hire me, just because, for a small company, going from 4 employees to 5 employees is a huge, huge, huge commitment. And I worked at universities where I was just one other cog, and there were 15,000 people working for the university. But to go from 4 employees to 5 was a big decision. And so eventually, but he was catching me like I had defended my dissertation at that point. I was kind of in this middle place where I wasn't sure what my next move was going to be. I was thinking about doing a postdoc somewhere. And so I was getting ready where I really needed to make a decision about where I was going to move my family. And so I just gave Patrick an ultimatum and said, look, I would love to spend my blood and sweat working for you, but offer me the job and I'll show up in a couple weeks. And Patrick took a few days to think about it and offered me the gig. And suddenly I found myself moving the family up to the north and doing this full time, which has been, it's been a huge transformation from the way I worked design before. It's a completely different ball game, I think.
And so, has it been everything you assumed, or did you have any assumptions? And what are those differences in the design work to the way you were working before?
Well, before you had to go slowly because you had to work slowly just because you didn't have the time to work quickly. And so there was this rhythm in the way design works, where you'd work and then you would try to make changes to a version, and maybe if you made them fast enough, you'd be able to play test on Saturday. And then you'd spend a week thinking about changes, maybe another week thinking about changes, and then you'd make updates, and maybe you made the weekend deadline, and you'd print things off at work on Friday, you'd play on Saturday. And that was true of playtesting too. With, when I was thinking about playtesting schedules, everything was built around how many weekends can my external playtesters work, and at what pace can I not exhaust them? So you would work slowly. Even if I knew a design was broken, I needed to fix it, I knew I couldn't send out an update right away because I'd exhaust my playtesters. So there was a very processional nature to design, and a design could incubate. I mean, Pamir incubated for many, many years, but then it had about a year of development before active development began, where I was working and playing it, but it could be slow. And when you're doing it full time, when we did Root, and I guess I'm saying that in the past tense out of hopefulness because it's not quite done yet, but we're close. But when we did Root in the fall, Patrick said, look, this is a studio priority, which means if you need something, you can just grab playtesters from other people's tables. So interrupt the salesperson. He needs to go be a playtester right now. And if you need, me to help you develop, you can just pull me away from my desk. And it allowed us to work so quickly. So previously, I sort of think of in terms of major iterations. An iteration would be maybe 2 months. That's 2 months. You'd maybe produce about 10 plays, and then you'd create slowly a new version, and then you'd put out that, and it'd get another, probably 10 plays over those weeks. In the studio, we could do about 2 months of work in a single week because we're having morning playtests for maybe playing twice a day. So we have those morning playtests, and by the end of the week, I have notes, and then the following Monday, I build the next playtest kit, and we play it all week. And that pace allowed us to iterate and develop. I think Root would have, if I would have worked alone on Root, it would have taken me several years. And the active development for that game has been about 6 months. And that is a scarily short period when I think about a lot of the other designs I've worked on. But it has been more than, I think Root has had easily twice or even 3 times as much labor as any other product I've worked on. And it's happened in a fraction of the time. The other thing I'll mention about the differences in working in terms of my own expectations, I didn't have a lot. I had worked at small companies before, and the thing that I really like working at small companies. And in fact, that was the one thing about working at the university that I never quite dialed into. The idea that if I would have had a university post, I would have been like the Victorianist in the English department in this big, vast tree. I always liked working at small companies where I often did little sidelines throughout graduate school because everyone needs to be very accountable for their work, and you have a lot of freedom to define your own job description. And so one of the great, one of the things I love most about this job is I come to work and we're all still learning what it means to be a company that makes games. Vast was made while Patrick was working as a programmer, and it was submitted by somebody who was a marketer, and so that they worked together, but they were working on evenings, and the artist was working on evenings. And Root, in some ways, Root is the first game developed in-house by Leader Games. And it bears out on the art, it bears out on the design, on every element. Because we have, Kyle is our full-time artist. So when I tell him, Kyle, I'd love it if we could have little sketches in the rulebook. I think it would look nice and it would break up the flow of the text. He says, okay, we'd love to do that. He's like, that sounds great. Let's do it. And so because he's on retainer, and he's like, we are all investing so much energy into the game that I think it's like, if you put it next to anything else that's going to blow it out of the park, just because the amount of time and energy that we're stuffing in that box is, I think it's just huge.
So your next game, I'm absolutely intimidated by, and this is 1830. Why am I so scared of 18xx games? Because
they're long. They're long, and you have to use a calculator. I think that, that was it for me. That was why I didn't play them for so long. I think that they're games that ask a lot of their players. They are games that don't stop you from making a colossal mistake and then having to sit there on your hands for 4 hours while the game finishes because you don't know enough about the game to rescue your position, or, as is often the case even with me, like my position is just not redeemable. They present a huge tax to their players. I mean, at the start of the show, you talked about how I mentioned how I've been playing less of long games just because I've got a couple kids now, and my job sometimes takes up all of my time. I can't really sit down for 6 hours and play a game anymore. But despite all of that, they're worth it. It's a remarkable thing. They are as interesting as a game that as interesting as games can get. The most interesting questions I find are all bound up in that genre. They present me with really, I think that they present just fabulous, tricky situations that dwell in my mind long after we packed up the game. In the greater series of 18xx games, there are dozens of games, maybe even 100 or so, that are so different. You would despite the fact that they share the similar rules framework, they're as different as any two Euros could be from each other. And they're immensely competitive and interactive, and they are, and again, like Titan, for people interested in design, you can do no better than play a lot of 1830. And so the reason I picked 1830 in particular is it's one of the earliest and also probably the best of the series, at least of the ones I've played. There are some that I will, depending on the weather, maybe prefer more. But 1830 is a game I've played 30 or 40 times, which is a lot for a game that takes 5 or 6 hours to play. And I would gladly play it again. I am consistently learning things about that game which completely transform how I think about the entire game.
And if you wish to think of yourself as a heavy gamer, do you think 18xx games are a necessary rite of passage?
I mean, they're definitely not for everyone because they are so interactive. I think there's a big group of heavy gamers that likes the crunchy conversion puzzles, but doesn't really like interaction. And for those people, you should stay as far away from the 18xx and from 1830 as you possibly can. But for the heavy gamers that like a wide selection of thumbscrews of which they can put on their opponents, you can do no better. And I think that, so I think for that group, it's an absolutely a rite of passage. You need to play them. And if you don't like them, you need to you need to go through the process of reacting against them and writing about them. And to that group, I would add anybody who thinks about design should study that genre, because to build a system which can sustain a whole sub-hobby for over 30 years is just a completely remarkable feat. I think, when I think there was a thread recently about the kind of Mount Rushmore of gaming and kind of seminal designers. And, you see the usual names like Knizia and Sid Sackson. And any one of those that doesn't include Francis Tresham, the designer of 18xx, is sorely missing. Because I think that I think that there is a core elegance to that system that more designers would be good to study and understand.
So what's in the future for Cole Wherle? I assume all of your design efforts now go into later games. Will you design other games on the side, or will all of your energy go into that? So
the agreement I have with Patrick is that he sort of gets right of first refusal on the things that I'm working on that I build in studio, with the understanding that he has a brand and an audience, and it's not exactly where I tend to put most of my work. In some ways, Root is my first game that's directed at this kind of general audience. And with that in mind, I've got a game I'm working on right now that I'm going to probably give to Hollandspiel, the company that did Infamous Traffic. And I've told that Patrick, I'm working on this game about land. It's about Ojibwe and American Indian. It's about Ojibwe and Dakota land buying in Minnesota, actually. And it's quite mean and strange. And it's I think, an interesting story about the interactions between native peoples and European empires in North America, and it is very much a Hollandspiel game. And it would never, there's no way it could possibly be retrofitted into the Leader Games brand. So I'm going to keep doing those odd games. I've got a bunch of games which I think will kind of complement John Company that I'm working on a little bit. And then I have a lot of projects within Leader Games. The plan is, right now I am working kind of every waking moment is being spent finishing Root. And after I'm done, I'm going to get some fallow studio time where I'm going to be able to work on a number of projects. We've got really exciting stuff that I'm kind of pushing along, adventure games and strategy games and all sorts of things that are kind of too early to be talked about profitably. But I think if anyone's worried that I'm going to stop making interactive weird games, they should not worry, both because Root is one of those games. I just got a message from someone the other day that said they had assumed that Root wouldn't be a very interesting game because it was being sold so much based on the art, which is so welcoming. But they were happy to find it was a compelling design. And I think this is not again when I praise Root, it's purely meant as praise of everyone in the studio. But Root is definitely a game that I think people who like the stuff I've done will like Root, and all the projects I'm working on have that similar kind of ethos behind them.
So your final game sort of brings us round in a circle to some degree. And this is Pax Porfiriana. And my first question is, what has Phil Eklund brought to gaming?
He found a way around the Ameritrash problem. And the Ameritrash problem is, how do you make a game thematic in this era which prioritizes smooth gameplay and really clean interlocking systems? Like, what do you do with theme? And so the way a lot of people answer that problem is they have event decks and they have lots of crufts and special powers and goofy things like that. And Phil understood that you can't just adopt a Euro engine, if we think about this in video game terms. You can't just take the Puerto Rico engine and then put a bunch of flavor text on it. That's not the way you make a thematic game. You have to think about the core structure, the core incentives of the game, and you need to think about the period and the theme, and you have to wait until you can get those things in alignment. And what is so remarkable about that answer is that Porfiriana is a game that took basically a massive open world, almost an RPG economic sandbox called Lords of the Sierra Madre that was published in the 80s and then in the 90s in a second edition. He took this big 10-hour game and he folded it into a card game, but without losing any of the detail. In fact, in some respects, Pax Porfiriana is more colorful and more thematic and tells a better story than the massive game. And then what's even more remarkable is that he did it again in PAX Renaissance. And I've been playing a lot of Megafauna 2, and him and Andrew Marker and Andrew Dole, he designed BIOS Megafauna 2 with. He took American Megafauna, this massive, crufty old war game, and he collapsed it all into the sleekest, most thematic and delightful little box imaginable. And so of all the PAX games, I think that Porfiriana has a cleanness to it and I think it is perfectly well suited to its period. And because of that, it has a level of immersion that I don't think has ever really been equaled in games like that.
So, okay, final question. You're driving off to the cabin, and you've got your foot down, and you go around a corner, and the car skids and the back door flies open. 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, and are swept away down a river. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat?
That's so hard. I mean, does every guest just pick the last game they talked about? I think it's got to be Porfiriana, because it scales so well, and it's so goofy, and I can always read all the flavor text. It's like a novel in there. I think it has to be Porfiriana.
So, if people want to get hold of you, how can they do that?
The best way to get a hold of me is on Twitter. I am at Cole Wherle, and that's ColeWehrle. I also am pretty good at responding to private messages on Board Game Geek, although right now I have a bit of a backlog, and I'm sorry to all those people.
So, Cole Wherle, thank you very much.
This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter. You can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can support the show at patreon.com/5G4D. And if I haven't had to pogo stick as fast as my springs will carry me to avoid the green-toothed beasties and the over-opinionated bellends, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.